decide to hold an area, defense is based on an anti-armor framework designed to repel attack from all directions. The enemy has the type and quantity of engineer resources to carry out mine-laying tasks and rapid digging, and thus can make the transition from offense to defense in a short period of time. The defense is organized in depth, incorporating a security zone and a main defense belt. The advancing force will encounter many obstacles in the security zone and as it penetrates the main defense belt. Engineers providing close support to the force will be required to perform all types of tasks. Engineers must be grouped to overcome minor natural and artificial obstacles, and the resources must be protected while moving and working if they are to give effective support. Mobility tasks in support of the force involve reconnaissance, mine clearing, minefield breaching, gap crossing, clearing debris, barricades and routes, and in maintenance and construction activities. Route reconnaissance is conducted in conjunction with the advancing division covering force and the brigade screens. It involves determination of going, classification and location of routes through or around obstacles, and assessments of time and resources required to make routes passable to the advancing main body. Minor artificial obstacles will have to be dealt with, and engineers will become involved in clearing booby traps, which may be incorporated in obstacles and randomly laid in built-up areas. Opening lanes through wire barriers, obstructing mounted and dismounted approaches. Clearing nuisance mines from minor obstacles, ford sites, and in likely assembly areas. And clearing abattis from roads and tracks. Minefield breaching will be required to maintain the momentum of the offense. Breaching will normally be limited to hasty techniques by armored engineers or armored units. Throughout the offensive battle, the Corps will encounter a number of short gaps which will impede its movement. Gap crossing resources are grouped by type at various levels to provide sufficient support to the formation without causing unnecessary logistical problems. The resources include support bridging, consisting of fixed and floating bridges, amphibious bridging resources, and assault bridging, such as armored vehicle-launched bridges. Within the division, gap crossing centers mainly on the AVLBs of the Armored Engineer Squadrons. Its bridges must be quickly recovered or replaced once the advancing elements have crossed. Small gaps can be traversed by fascines emplaced by a variety of equipments. Class 60 support bridging is used in a variety of tasks throughout the Corps area. It is centrally held and controlled at Corps level, with only limited quantities held within a division. The only support bridging found within the division is the medium girder bridge. Each division engineer support regiment holds sets of MGB to allow for the recovery and reuse of the AVLB's bridges in the assault role. Additional sets of MGB are held by the Corps Engineer Support Group and are intended for use during the later stages of a deliberate crossing or for spanning larger gaps. The Corps Amphibious Engineer Regiment holds the remaining support bridging resources. It is comprised of 2 amphibious squadrons and a floating bridge squadron. The amphibious squadrons hold self-propelled bridge elements, while the floating bridge squadron is equipped with workboats and floating pontoons that can be linked together. The regiment is capable of constructing and operating rafts and ferries. Engineers supporting a force which must move through a built-up area may become involved in the clearance of debris and barricades. This is a time and resource-consuming activity. Tasks involving the maintenance and construction of routes mainly include filling of craters, laying trackway and matting, constructing bypasses, bridges, and culverts, graveling and grading of routes, and removing or clearing snow. The primary counter-mobility task in support of an advancing force is flank protection. Here, engineers assist by denying routes to the enemy. preparing hasty obstacles on likely enemy approaches, and by planning and coordinating use of rapid response scatterable mine systems in cooperation with the Division G3 and artillery staff. Survivability tasks in the offense involve assisting forces digging in against an expected counterattack. General engineering support in the offense involves the leapfrogging of water points to keep pace with the advancing force, the maintenance and construction of helipads, and the production of engineer intelligence. To maintain the momentum of offensive operations, the CDE's estimate will concentrate on identifying what obstacles are likely to be encountered and the planned grouping of resources to overcome them. Major crossings such as those involving rivers and lakes must be dealt with by higher-level engineer resources, since the division has no integral amphibious capability. Major forested areas will require additional mobility support for the offensive force. Major minefields will also require increased engineer support. These resources must be ordered early and deployed to best suit the needs for security and availability. In addition, the estimate considers routes and going, the number, load classification and condition of forward and lateral routes, as well as off-route going. This helps determine the degree of engineer support needed and the ease with which engineer equipment can be moved and harbored. Additionally, weather, hours of darkness, and location of populated areas must be brought into the estimate. Offensive planning involves the general intentions of the enemy, the time available for him to prepare obstacles and defensive works, his engineer manpower and resources available to construct and carry out denial operations, the deployment security of our engineers on the move, and their protection while at the task site. In most cases, engineer reconnaissance elements and other resources must be deployed well forward to identify engineer tasks and to bring engineer resources into action in the shortest period of time. During offensive operations, tasks vary from multitudes of close support activities which dictate decentralized control to those which require centralized control of division and assigned corps engineer resources, such as major obstacle crossing. Control involves a balance between the need to deploy engineer resources as close as possible to the task and yet provide for their security. Engineer elements may be grouped under command of the advance force, such as in a covering force mission, when engineer support would be in the form of reconnaissance and assault crossing elements. Engineers with the advance guard, normally a field squadron and elements of an armored engineer squadron, are assigned in support and under command for movement. They are tasked to report enemy activity, to report on and find routes around or through obstacles, and provide support during assaults on enemy positions. The main body would normally contain the majority of the division engineer resources, with a field squadron group in support of each brigade. The remaining resources would permit the CDE the flexibility of applying the engineer effort where it is most needed as the battle develops. Engineer elements assigned to flank and rear guard forces will vary in size with the threat and would be equipped with rapid mine laying and digging capability. They would normally be grouped in support and under command for movement. Engineer resources are critical to the success of a division attack against a part of the enemy main defense area, and they should be deployed well forward with the force they are supporting. Engineer resources should be dispersed and well concealed from air and ground observation. Captured enemy equipment, engineer and defense stores would be used whenever possible to minimize the need to move our own resources forward. The field troops supporting the leading battle groups are seldom without additional engineer resources provided from the Division Engineer Support Regiment or from the Armored Engineers. These may include AVLBs and AEVs with fascine loads, possibly some rollers, plows, or explosive lane clearing charges. Engineer heavy equipment such as dozers, front-end loaders, and trucks with Class 60 trackway or matting. Some mine dispensing systems, or mechanical mine layers for laying of flank minefields, and possibly some water crossing resources, such as assault boats or rafting elements. The division's engineers are a key element in maintaining the momentum of offensive operations. Their work is demanding, and they require the maximum of support and protection. Wherever possible, obstacles should be circumvented so as to only commit engineer resources when absolutely necessary.
A threat-forward detachment has slipped across the FIBA and seized a piece of key terrain. The division commander has ordered the depth brigade to dislodge the enemy incursion prior to the arrival of first echelon elements. Reconnaissance has reported the enemy digging in, along with signs of mining and other obstacle development activity on the main approach to the position. Mindful of the requirement to maintain the momentum of the attack, the leading tank squadron has attached its 2 mine rollers. These, along with its 4 permanently mounted mine plows, configure it for an encounter with mines and other obstacles. The initial squadron deployment places its mine rollers well forward as part of the lead elements. The lead commander expects to find conventional and scatterable mines at bridge sites, around roadblocks, at intersections, on the shoulders of sharp curves and narrow tracks, in old ruts, and beside blown culverts and craters. Hasty minefields of approximately 150 mines can be laid by a threat mobile obstacle detachment in approximately 20 minutes, with a 3-row configuration covering a frontage of about 300 meters. These unmarked, hastily emplaced conventional or scatterable minefields will most likely be covered by fire, and the first indication of their presence may be the destruction of a vehicle. Immediate suppressive fire would be returned on the enemy position. Smoke would be used to cover the stricken vehicle, to assist with the evacuation of crew casualties, and to help conceal the forward movement plow and roller teams. Reconnaissance elements will attempt to find routes through these minefields. Or, if there is no alternative, will define its edge and begin to recce a possible breaching site. A hasty breach will then be attempted, which uses the on-hand assets of the battle group and is accomplished without a loss of momentum directly from the line of march. Should it extend beyond a 30-minute time frame, increasingly severe opposition will be met, including the possibility of the minefield being thickened by artillery-delivered scatterable mines. The battle group would be divided into a support force, a breaching force, and an assault force. A support force to suppress the defenders with direct and indirect fire and to obscure the breaching activity. A breaching force to conduct the breach, mark the lanes, and secure the far side. And an assault force to continue the attack against the objective. The breaching force will have its organic tank-mounted mine plows and rollers for clearing and proofing of lanes, as well as mine detectors and probes. In addition, lane clearing charges may also have been allotted to the force from Division Engineer Resources. Breaching operations would involve the support force engaging targets and laying down smoke, while the breaching force maneuvers into position. At least 2 lanes would be attempted through the minefield, each handled by a breaching team. The teams would lead with the plow and proof the lanes with the roller. The lanes are marked by the rear elements of the breaching force once the success of the breach is assured. Once across, the breach force regroups and provides fire support for the oncoming assault force. Mine clearing equipment is most effective when used with roller plow teams. The roller will lead when there is a known or suspected minefield threat. Upon detection of a minefield, the roller tank will fire its smoke dischargers and move to cover. The plow then proceeds to clear a lane by passing the roller, continuing to at least 100 meters plus of where the last mine was detonated. And the roller then moves forward to proof the lane. As a last resort, expedient methods of breaching may also be employed, such as aiming unmanned vehicles at the objective or using tank dozers to clear surface landmines. Bulling through, where additional casualties must be accepted. Hand breaching, although slow and dangerous, may be the only alternative. Hasty breaching operations are conducted as a normal activity of the combat team. Mine rollers and plows offer tanks the capability of maintaining the momentum of the advance, and engineer reconnaissance and support elements are deployed well forward, where they can report and act with a minimum of delay. Wherever possible, these minefields must be breached in a matter of minutes so as to minimize casualties and prevent an enemy from reinforcing the objective area.
Was a year in which the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Forces continued to face the ever-increasing challenges of meeting Canada's defense commitments and assisting the international community. At the same time, the Canadian forces continued to replace equipment and prepare for the future. The Canadian forces are Canada's largest peace movement. Canada has participated in almost every United Nations peacekeeping operation since 1948. They've also been members of some that were not sponsored by the UN. Over 80,000 Canadian men and women have worn the blue beret or other identification as peacekeepers. Canada's single largest peacekeeping task continues to be in Cyprus. Canadian soldiers have served there since 1964. In March of 1989, the Royal Canadian Dragoons from Petawawa, Ontario, took over the Canadian sector. In the fall, they were replaced by the Winnipeg-based 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Earlier in the year, the Canadian government accepted a request from the United Nations to appoint a Canadian as commander of the UN forces in Cyprus. And in April, Major General Clive Milner took command of the 2,300 British, Canadian, Austrian, and Danish troops on the island. It's the first time in 30 years that a Canadian has commanded a UN force. The appointment indicates the high esteem in which Canada is held in the international peacekeeping community. With the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, refugees returning to their homes in the Afghan countryside face countless landmines and booby traps, a legacy of their country's struggle. In an effort to help those refugees prepare for the future, the first 12-member team of Canadian Forces explosive experts was sent to Peshawar, Pakistan in late March. The team instructed Afghan refugees on mine awareness, safety measures, and simple methods of clearing mines. 3 women were included amongst the officers in the 1st Canadian team. They trained Afghan women who in turn taught the skills they had learned to other Afghan women and their children. It is they who are most at risk from the presence of mines. By the end of 1989, 3 teams of Canadians had helped teach the Afghans this vital knowledge. In April, 250 Canadians arrived in Namibia as part of the newly created United Nations Transition Assistance Group, or UNTAG. UNTAG's role is to assist Namibia's transition to independent nationhood. The Canadian contingent's largest element is 89 Canadian Logistics Unit. It provides transportation and supply platoons to the United Nations Logistics Support Group, which in turn supports the 4,700-member UNTAG force. And in 1989, Canadian Forces personnel found themselves involved in another new and challenging peacekeeping situation. With the deployment of Canadian Forces members to Central America, Canada's contribution to world peacekeeping duties increased to 9 missions involving 1,300 servicemen and women. About 160 reservists were among those who served with peacekeeping missions outside Canada in 1989. This further demonstrates that the total force concept can work, since they stand alongside their regular force partners not only in training, but also on operational duty. Canadian peacekeepers span the globe, wearing their blue berets on the Golan Heights, in Iran and Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Korea, in Israel, Syria and Lebanon, in India or Pakistan, on Cyprus, in Namibia, and in Central America. Others wear the orange beret of the multinational force and observers in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. No matter where you find them, Canada's armed forces continue their proud tradition of contributing to the international efforts of conflict resolution and peace. When it comes to reducing tension among the world's nations, peacekeeping operations are the department's most visible actions. But there are many other less visible efforts that are as important. For example, Experts on arms control from the Department of National Defense and the Armed Forces participate in international forums and conferences. In January, the Defense Department announced that Canada would undertake a series of measures aimed at improving military relations with the Soviet Union. These included reciprocal ships visits to Soviet ports, talks at a senior level between Soviet and Canadian military staffs, and an invitation for Soviet officials to visit the Defense Research Establishment at Suffield, Alberta. In July, a Soviet delegation observed the chemical agent destruction process being used in Canada. And later in the year, a delegation of senior Canadian military officers visited the Soviet Union. Exchanges such as these include familiarization visits to defense bases, discussions, and sharing of information on arms control measures. Canada remains committed to peace, security, and sovereignty through collective defense. Canada's security is ensured through membership in NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. April 4th marked the 40th anniversary of NATO. The alliance is now made up of 16 nations, 600 million people united in their quest of maintaining peace by means of a common defense. Our enduring peace exists thanks to the alliance's two goals: maintaining a deterrent against hostilities through a strong defense and promoting arms control. Being a member of NATO is of great benefit to Canada. It provides national security at far less cost than an independent or neutral policy. It also gives Canada an equal voice in collective decisions taken by the alliance, while allowing the pursuit of an independent foreign policy. And NATO is not only a military alliance, it's also a forum for the exchange of ideas on political, economic, scientific, and social issues. The bulk of our military contribution in Europe to the alliance consists of a land division and an air division. That land division was officially dedicated to a Central European role on November 30th during a ceremony held at Lahr, West Germany. Canada's 4th Mechanized Brigade is located in Germany and makes up one half of the land division. The other half is the 5e Groupe Brigade du Canada. It would be sent overseas from its base in Valcartier, Quebec, in time of increased tension. Some 8,000 Canadian Forces troops plus their families live in Europe. Most of them reside and work at our two main bases located at Lahr and Baden-Solingen, West Germany. Baden-Solingen is home to 3 CF-18 squadrons of 1 Canadian Air Division. Like the Land Division, only half of the Air Division's strength is in Europe. The rest would fly over from their bases in Canada when they were needed. Canada also contributes a destroyer on a rotational basis to the Standing Naval Force Atlantic, which is a fleet of warships from various NATO members. The sailors of Her Majesty's Canadian ships Marguerite, Saguenay, and Ottawa spent lengthy periods away from their families during 1989 while their ships sailed with the force. Canada's traditional ties to Europe continue as a cornerstone of Canada's defense commitments. But our country continues to increase its social and economic ties with the Pacific Rim nations. Changes to the Canadian Navy reflect this fact. In 1989, 443 Helicopter Squadron was moved to the West Coast, along with the helicopter-carrying destroyer Annapolis. HMCS Huron, a destroyer also capable of carrying Sea King helicopters, had been transferred from Halifax to Esquimalt, British Columbia, along with 2 helicopters in 1987. Before these moves, Canada had no anti-submarine helicopters on the West Coast. These transfers helped balance our anti-submarine capability on both coasts. They also enhanced the Canadian Forces' ability to respond to search and rescue needs on the Pacific Coast. In June, the government purchased 3 Arctic and maritime surveillance aircraft. The planes are called Arcturus and are similar to the CP-140 Auroras that the Canadian forces operate, except that they do not have anti-submarine capability. The Arcturus will be used for military, environmental, maritime, and Arctic surveillance. They will also increase Canada's ability to effectively patrol its coastline and enforce our sovereignty. In 1989, the Navy continued to move forward with the replacement of some of its older destroyers. At year's end, 7 new frigates were at various stages of construction. These ships are part of a program that will add 12 new frigates to the Navy's inventory. At the same time, other Navy ships are undergoing major modifications. Built in the early 70s, the 4 Tribal-class destroyers are being updated and modernized. Their capabilities will be greatly enhanced. New air defense weapons, improved engines, and more effective command and control facilities will ensure the destroyers remain operationally fit for the future. In September, Canada's Naval Reserves commissioned 2 mine countermeasures vessels at a ceremony held in Halifax. The Moresby and the Anticosti will provide the reserves with valuable mine warfare training experience. The expansion of the Naval Reserve as part of the total force concept continued in October when a new unit was commissioned in Sept-Îles, Quebec. HMCS Joliette is the 4th such unit established in Quebec in the last 3 years in an attempt to increase the presence of the Navy in that province. Meanwhile, the government announced plans for the purchase of 221 light armored vehicles for Canada's militia regiments. The purchase of these vehicles will continue the modernization and re-equipping of the militia. Delivery will begin in the summer of 1990. The modernization of the Land Forces military pattern truck fleet continued in 1989. In June, defense officials attended the rollout ceremony of the first of the Army's new 10-ton trucks. By the time deliveries completed in 1991, Canada's land forces will have received 1,200 of the heavy trucks. Canada and the United States share the world's longest undefended border. But under the North American Aerospace Defense Agreement, Canadian and U.S. forces operate a system of long and short-range radars, airborne radars, and deployment airfields. This network is capable of detecting air or spaceborne threats, such as bombers or missiles. It is backed up by fighter interceptor aircraft located strategically about the continent. Canada's NORAD fighters are CF-18s. A number of them are kept on constant state of alert at our 2 main fighter bases located at Cold Lake, Alberta, and Bagotville, Quebec. At the same time, detachments from those bases occupy forward operating locations closer to the country's coasts. These planes are ready to fly out, intercept, and identify any airborne threat approaching the continent. While it has now taken delivery of all its new CF-18s, the Air Force said goodbye to an old friend in 1989. After nearly 50 years of exceptional service, the C-47 Dakota, affectionately known as the Goonie Bird, made its final flights and retired from military service in Canada. 2 of the last Dakotas were painted up in World War II colors. In March, one flew west wearing the markings of D-Day when the Allies invaded Europe in June of 1944. The other flew east, carrying the Canucks Unlimited logo, recognized by all those in the Asian theater who relied on the Canadian flyers to deliver supplies in the mountains and jungles of Burma and India. They visited bases and cities across Canada and allowed enthusiasts and many who flew in them one last chance to see a serving Canadian Forces Goonie Bird fly. 2 of Canada's infantry regiments celebrated history of their own in 1989. The Royal 22e Régiment and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were formed at the outbreak of the Great War. In the past 75 years, Vandus and Patricias have served in both world wars, Korea, with NATO, and in many peacekeeping operations. The regiments marked their years of proud service to Canada with a series of celebrations across the country and by a ceremonial parade on Parliament Hill. 200 patricias also reenacted their World War I homecoming parade in Ottawa and marched past the National War Memorial. Canada's military have often been called upon to come to the aid of people caught in the path of nature's fury, and in 1989 that tradition continued. Hit by some of the worst forest fires on record, Manitobans fought a fierce and sometimes desperate battle to save several towns and villages. The Canadian forces helped fly residents of 22 northern communities to safer places. 8 fixed-winged aircraft and 4 helicopters flew 125 missions and moved supplies and nearly 6,000 people. And in late September, Hurricane Hugo swept through the Caribbean and on some islands left near total devastation in its wake. The next day, a Canadian Forces Hercules delivered civil authorities, food and relief supplies from Barbados to Montserrat, St. Kitts and Antigua. But there was more to be done. After consultation with international relief agencies, it was decided that Canadian Forces aid could be best used to relieve the disaster situation on Montserrat. That tiny island was without doubt the worst hit by Hugo. Critical to this relief effort was the immediate restoration of an effective air traffic control capability. On September 27th, a portable control tower was flown in from Trenton, Ontario, and put into operation. The airlift and relief effort could now go on. The 4 members of a communications line crew were tasked to lay phone lines between government agencies to establish basic telephone communications. 25 field engineers from Petawawa set about assisting the local authorities in restoring power and water facilities. They also began repairing Montserrat's control tower and airport facilities. The Canadian International Development Agency purchased 6 large generators. Canadian Forces engineers assisted in the startup and maintenance of the generators, which provided the power to get drinking water flowing again. In January, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney selected a new federal cabinet and named 2 new ministers to the defense portfolio. Bill McKnight of wartime Saskatchewan was appointed minister, and Mary Collins of Vancouver took over as associate minister. The role of women in Canadian society and in the military continues to expand. Associate Defense Minister Mary Collins announced in March that the department would begin implementing the decision of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal concerning the role of women in the armed forces. Nearly all occupations, units, and positions are now accessible to women. This also means that women are no longer excluded from the most senior appointments in the forces. General Paul Manson, Chief of Defense Staff for the previous 3 years, took to the air one last time in 1989 before retiring as Canada's top military man. A few days later, he said his farewell to the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who served him, and handed over command of the Canadian Forces to General John de Chastelain during a parade held in Ottawa. General de Chastelain takes command of Canada's military in challenging times. In 1989, the world continued to evolve in ways impossible to imagine just a few short years ago. New roles and priorities are being determined in order to maintain a credible level of defense, especially in light of new budgetary realities. Peacekeeping missions increase yearly, and Canada's professionalism and expertise in that field continue to be drawn upon by a world struggling to reduce international conflict. Through it all, the men and women of Canada's armed forces and the 35,000 civilian members of the Department of National Defense continue to meet the challenges head-on. They take pride in the job they do for their country and in the help they bring to their fellow Canadians and the people of other nations.